I spent 10 years being the ignored wife of an ambitious man, but the night he forgot my birthday, I discovered the dark, criminal secret he was hiding in our basement. Now, it's not just our marriage at stake, it's our lives. My husband, Mark, has a calendar on his phone that alerts him to everything: business meetings, oil changes, his fantasy football drafts, and even the dry cleaning pickup. For 10 years, I've been a secondary entry in that digital life, a note tucked into the margins of his ambition. But today was different. Today was my 35th birthday, a milestone I had spent weeks subtly highlighting. I left jewelry store brochures on the coffee table. I mentioned my favorite restaurant, the one that requires a reservation a month in advance, 3 times during dinner last week. I wore the dress he told me he loved, the one that makes me feel like the woman I was before I became the woman who manages his chaotic life. When I woke up this morning, the side of the bed was already cold. Mark had left for a breakfast meeting before the sun was fully up. I checked my phone, expecting a notification, a sweet text, even a generic happy birthday gif. Nothing. Not a ping, not a buzz, just the sterile silence of a Monday morning. I brushed it off, telling myself he was probably planning a surprise. That's what a rational person tells themselves when they're desperate to avoid the crushing reality that they don't matter as much as they thought they did. I went through my day, maintaining the facade, answering work emails, and keeping my phone close, watching the screen light up with spam, work alerts, and my mother's well wishes. By 7 p.m., I had the table set for 2. I'd prepared his favorite meal, the one that takes hours of slow simmering and meticulous prep. I poured a glass of wine and waited. 8 p.m. turned into 9 p.m. The food grew cold, and the wine tasted like iron. I finally heard the click of the front door. I stood up, smoothing my dress, ready to forgive the tardiness, ready to be the gracious, understanding wife. Mark walked in, his suit jacket slung over his shoulder, his tie loosened. He didn't look at the table. He didn't look at me. He walked straight to the kitchen, opened the fridge, and pulled out a bottle of beer. "Rough day?" I asked, my voice tight. He didn't even turn around. "You have no idea." The board meeting went 3 hours over, and then I had to drive Marcus to the airport because he lost his keys. "I'm exhausted, Sarah. Please, let's just skip the small talk tonight." He walked right past me toward the stairs, his eyes glued to his phone, his thumb flicking rapidly across the screen. He hadn't smelled the rosemary and garlic lingering in the air. He hadn't noticed the candles. He hadn't noticed me. As he reached the landing, he paused, not to acknowledge my existence, but to answer a call. "Yeah, I'm home," he said into the phone, his tone suddenly softening, light and playful. "No, I didn't forget. I'll be there in 5 minutes." He hung up, grabbed his keys off the counter, and turned back toward the door without a second glance. I stood in the center of the kitchen, surrounded by the ghost of a celebration that never happened, as the front door swung shut with a hollow, definitive thud. My heart wasn't breaking, it was hardening. I picked up my phone, opened my browser, and typed in a search query I had never dared to contemplate before: how to file for divorce in this county. I was still sitting in the dark when I heard the familiar sound of his car pulling back into the driveway an hour later. My pulse quickened, not with love, but with a cold, calculated clarity. I walked to the hallway and stood in the shadows just as he entered. He looked disheveled, a smear of something dark on his collar that definitely wasn't mine. He looked up, finally noticing me, his face twisting into an expression of annoyance. "Why are you still sitting in the dark? You're acting like a ghost, Sarah. It's creepy." He brushed past me, heading toward the bedroom, but as he moved, a small silver object slipped from his pocket and clattered onto the hardwood floor. It was a keychain, but not the one for our house. It was a heart-shaped tag with an engraving I couldn't quite read from where I stood. I stepped forward to pick it up, but his foot slammed down onto it, pinning it to the ground. He looked at me, his eyes wide and uncharacteristically panicked, his usual dismissive arrogance replaced by a jagged, sharp-edged fear that told me everything I needed to know. "Don't," he hissed, his voice dropping to a dangerous, low register. "Don't you dare touch that." I stared at his foot, the weight of his heel pinning the silver tag to the floorboards as if it were a venomous insect he was desperate to crush. His breath was shallow, hitching in his chest, and for the first time in 10 years, I saw him not as a husband, but as a cornered animal. The air in the hallway felt suddenly thin, sucked dry by the weight of the lie he was currently standing on. "Is that why the board meeting went long, Mark?" I asked, my voice terrifyingly steady, a stark contrast to the earthquake rattling my insides. "Did the board of directors start handing out commemorative keychains to their favorite employees?" He didn't move. His jaw was clenched so tight I could see the muscle pulsing near his ear. "Go to bed, Sarah. You're tired, you're emotional, and you're saying things that are going to make tomorrow very difficult for both of us." "Tomorrow is already ruined," I whispered, stepping closer. I didn't care about the threat. I didn't care about the sanctity of our vows, which he had clearly shredded months ago. I only cared about the truth. I reached down, my hand steady as stone, and gripped his ankle. He recoiled, shouting a curse, but the movement caused his foot to slip just enough for me to snatch the object from the floor. He lunged for me, his hand catching my wrist, his grip bruising. He wasn't the man who opened doors for me, or brought me tea when I had a migraine. He was a stranger, fueled by the frantic energy of a man caught in the act. "Give it here," he barked, his face inches from mine, his eyes wild. "Let go of me, Mark," I said, my voice ice, "or I swear to God I will scream loud enough to wake every neighbor on this block. And we both know how much you hate being the subject of their gossip." He hesitated, his fingers digging into my skin. Then he shoved me backward. I stumbled, hitting the wall, but I didn't let go of the keychain. I clutched it so hard, the metal bit into my palm, drawing a tiny bead of blood. He paced the small hallway like a caged panther, running his hands through his hair, his composure completely shattered. He looked at the closed bedroom door, then back at me, his eyes darting toward the garage door. "You have no idea what you're holding," he muttered, his voice trembling. "That isn't what you think it is. Just put it back, apologize, and we can go upstairs. We can pretend this night never happened. We can go back to how things were." "How things were?" I laughed, a sharp, hollow sound that echoed off the walls. "You mean the silence? The cold dinners? The way you haven't looked at me with anything other than indifference for years? I don't want that, Mark. I want the truth." I flipped the silver heart over. It wasn't a name. It wasn't a date. It was a serial number and a location, a GPS coordinate etched in precise, laser-cut script. I knew that coordinate. I had spent the last 2 hours researching local property records. It wasn't an apartment or a hotel. It was a storage unit, 10 miles outside the city, registered to a shell company I had been tracking for 3 weeks, a company I had discovered was siphoning money from our joint savings. He saw me reading it, saw the realization dawn on my face, and his expression shifted from panic to something far colder. He stepped into the light of the hallway, his face unreadable, his phone vibrating incessantly in his pocket. He didn't answer it this time. He just stood there, looking at me as if he were calculating exactly how much of a problem I had become. "You shouldn't have looked that closely," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that made the hair on my arm stand up. He took a slow, deliberate step toward me, blocking the path to the front door. "You were supposed to just be the wife who stays home, makes dinner, and waits for a man who doesn't come home. You were supposed to be easy, Sarah. Why couldn't you just be easy?" He reached into his jacket pocket, and for a terrifying second, I thought he was pulling out a weapon. Instead, He pulled out a thick manila envelope and tossed it onto the kitchen counter with a dull thud. You want a change of pace? Fine. There's a lawyer's card in that envelope. Call them in the morning. But don't you dare think you're walking out of here with anything more than the clothes on your back. I've been preparing for this day a lot longer than you have. I stared at the envelope, then at him. The betrayal was so profound, so layered, that I felt a strange, detached calm wash over me. I reached into my own pocket, pulling out the small voice recorder I had tucked away an hour ago, the one I'd been using to capture his confession. I pressed stop, and the little red light blinked out. I don't need your lawyer, Mark, I said, holding up the recorder. I think the one I've already hired is going to be much more interested in what you just said. His face went ashen, his arrogance vanishing in a heartbeat. He lunged for the recorder, but just as he reached me, his phone rang again, a harsh, dissonant ringtone that pierced the silence. He stopped, glancing at the screen, and his entire posture collapsed. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at the recorder. He stared at the caller ID, his hands shaking so violently he nearly dropped the phone. "Oh no," he whispered, his face draining of all color. They found it. They found the unit. The color drained from Mark's face so rapidly, he looked like he might faint. The phone in his hand continued to pulse with light, a rhythmic, mocking heartbeat. He didn't answer it. He couldn't. He looked at the device as if it were a bomb set to detonate, his thumb hovering over the screen, paralyzed by the weight of whatever was on the other end of that line. "Who is it, Mark?" I demanded, my own fear starting to prickle against my skin. The air in the house, already heavy with the scent of stagnant food and broken promises, now felt charged with something far more dangerous. "Who is calling you at 11 o'clock at night, and what unit did they find?" He didn't answer. He turned his back to me, pressing the phone to his ear, his voice barely a breath. "I told you to wait," he hissed into the speaker. "I told you I was handling it. You weren't supposed to go there until I gave the signal." I didn't wait for him to finish. I bypassed him, my feet moving with a frantic, adrenaline-fueled purpose. I didn't care about the divorce papers on the counter or the recordings in my pocket. The look in his eyes, a cocktail of sheer terror and unadulterated fury, told me that our problems had moved far beyond infidelity and financial mismanagement. This wasn't just a marriage falling apart. This was a life being dismantled by something hidden, something dark. I grabbed my car keys from the hook by the door. Mark spun around, his hand snaking out to grab my arm, but I ducked under his reach, my survival instinct overriding any lingering shred of concern for the man I used to love. "Don't you walk out that door," he commanded, his voice cracking. "Sarah, listen to me. If you go to that storage facility, there is no coming back. You think you're filing for divorce? You go down there, and you'll be burying me, and yourself, right along with it. You should have thought about the consequences before you started playing games with people who have the power to scare you, Mark," I snapped, reaching for the handle. "They are just people," he screamed, the sound echoing off the high ceilings. "They're investors, and that unit? That's not my money in there, Sarah. It's theirs. It's all of it. Every dime of the firm's offshore capital. I was just the shell, the placeholder. If that unit is empty, we're already dead." I froze, my hand hovering over the deadbolt. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I turned back to look at him, my mind racing through the last few months, the late nights, the sudden influx of cash, the way he'd been jumpy every time a courier dropped off a package. I had assumed he was having an affair. I had prepared for a settlement, for alimony, for the humiliation of being the cast-aside wife. I had never prepared to be a partner in a multi-million-dollar criminal enterprise. "You're a money launderer?" I whispered, the absurdity of it hitting me like a physical blow. "You weren't just cheating on me, Mark. You were using our life as a front for a crime syndicate? He let out a jagged, hysterical laugh, slumping against the kitchen island. A front? We were the perfect picture of stability. No one looks twice at the boring suburban couple in the cul-de-sac. That was the point. He looked at me then, really looked at me, with a strange, pathetic longing. I did it for us, Sarah. For the house, for the future, for the life you always said we deserved. I never asked for this, I replied, my voice shaking. I asked for a birthday dinner. I asked for you to be present. I wrenched the door open, the cool night air hitting my face like a slap of reality. I didn't look back as I scrambled into my car, my hands trembling so violently I could barely fit the key into the ignition. My phone chimed, a text message from an unknown number. I glanced at it as the engine roared to life. We have the girl. You have the papers. The exchange happens at the unit in 20 minutes. If she's not there, you both are. I slammed the car into reverse, the tires screeching against the asphalt. I was halfway down the driveway when I saw a black SUV turn the corner, its headlights cutting through the darkness like the eyes of a predator. They weren't heading for the house. They were heading toward the storage unit. And in the backseat of that SUV, silhouetted against the street lamps, I saw something that made me jam on the brakes. It was a small, familiar, pink backpack. The one I had given my sister's daughter for her birthday last week. My heart stopped. My sister had taken her to the park today. She was supposed to be home by now. I grabbed my phone, dialing my sister's number, but it went straight to voicemail. Then, the black SUV slowed down, its window rolling down just enough to reveal a gloved hand holding a phone, pointing it directly at my windshield. A photo popped up on my screen, a live feed of me sitting in my car, looking terrified. Then, a text from the same unknown number. Your husband forgot your birthday, Sarah. Let's see if he remembers how to save you. The black SUV didn't wait for a response. It accelerated, its tires spitting gravel as it veered sharply onto the main road, heading toward the industrial district where the storage units sat like silent, concrete tombs. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, rhythmic protest against the gravity of the situation. My niece was in that car. My sister's world was about to be obliterated because Mark had decided to play banker for monsters. I didn't think. I moved. I floored the accelerator, my sedan fishtailing as I swung into the street behind the SUV. I wasn't the easy wife anymore. I was a woman whose family had been dragged into a shadow war, and the cold, calculated anger that had started as a desire for a divorce had now calcified into a singular, sharp-edged weapon. I kept my distance, the red taillights of the SUV acting as my only lighthouse in the darkness of the industrial park. As we approached the gated perimeter of the storage facility, the SUV didn't even slow down. It smashed through the chain-link barricade as if it were spun sugar. I veered off, cutting my lights, and skidded to a halt behind a row of rusted shipping containers, scrambling out before the engine had even ticked into silence. I didn't have a weapon, but I had the voice recorder in my pocket, and the heavy metal keychain Mark had dropped. It was a brutal, jagged piece of steel. I crept through the labyrinth of metal units, my breath hitching as I heard voices echoing off the corrugated walls. "The unit is empty, boss," a man growled. The voice was guttural, impatient. "He didn't bring the codes. He's playing us." "Check the child again," another voice replied, colder and more clinical. "If the husband doesn't show in 3 minutes, we move to plan B." My blood turned to ice. I rounded the corner of Unit 402, peering through the sliver of a gap where the door had been pried open. Inside, illuminated by a single flickering halogen work light, was my niece, Lily, huddled in a corner, her eyes wide with terror, a piece of tape over her mouth. She looked up and saw me, her eyes widening, but I pressed a finger to my lips, signaling for absolute silence. I wasn't going to wait for Mark. I wasn't going to let these men decide who lived and who died. I saw a heavy pipe leaning against a pallet of gear, likely part of whatever investment Mark had been laundering, and I grabbed it. Then, I remembered the voice recorder. I pulled it out, cranked the volume to the max, and threw it as hard as I could toward the opposite end of the facility. Click. The sound of Mark's own confession, his voice admitting to every shell company, every fraudulent wire transfer, and every name of the syndicate leaders blasted through the speakers. The two men inside the unit spun around, their guns drawn, distracted by the sudden, incriminating audio echoing through the maze of metal. "What the hell?" the lead man shouted, turning away from the unit. It was the only opening I needed. I didn't rush the men. I rushed the door. I lunged inside, ripped the tape off Lily's mouth, and hauled her into my arms. She let out a muffled sob, burying her face in my shoulder. I didn't look back. I sprinted toward the back perimeter, where a small service gate was left unlatched. "Hey, over there!" a voice roared behind us. I didn't run like a victim. I ran like a mother. I threw the heavy keychain at the halogen light with everything I had. The glass shattered in a spray of sparks, plunging the facility into absolute, blinding darkness. I could hear their boots thundering on the concrete, shouting at each other, their confusion growing as the playback of Mark's confession continued to loop, filling the yard with his cowardice. I cleared the gate, threw Lily into the backseat of my car, and jammed the key into the ignition. Just as I peeled away, a pair of headlights surged toward me. Mark. He was screaming something, his face a mask of regret and panic, but I didn't stop. I clipped his side mirror, the screech of metal on metal of final, violent severance of our bond. I drove until the flashing lights of the city skyline appeared, until I found a police station. I didn't stop to explain the divorce. I walked into the lobby, drenched in sweat, holding Lily's hand, and dropped the voice recorder onto the sergeant's desk. "My name is Sarah," I said, my voice steady, my gaze unwavering, "and I have a confession to provide. But it's not mine." By morning, the news reports were already spiraling. The disappearance of a local businessman and the collapse of a major investment firm made headlines. But for me, the world had never been quieter. 2 weeks later, the divorce papers arrived. I didn't have to pay for a lawyer. The state had already seized his assets, including the house, to pay back the victims he had betrayed. I didn't care. I signed the documents in the sunlit living room of a small apartment I'd rented, far from the cul-de-sac and far from his reach. I looked at the signature line, the final goodbye to a man who had forgotten me years ago. I didn't sign it with a flourish. I signed it with the calm, terrifying realization that I was finally the architect of my own life. I walked to the window, watching the sunrise, and for the first time in a decade, I didn't wait for him to come home. I poured myself a cup of coffee, toasted the quiet, and threw the divorce decree into the shredder. I didn't need the papers to know he was gone. I was finally, irrevocably free.